I know in the past, I heard you say that you have maybe a bit of a concern around like de-skilling the migration program. Would you be able to maybe touch on that in relation to those comments just at the end there?
Yeah. The one that worries me a little is the continued sort of tension between the nomination schemes for permanent entry and the independent migration. Part of that's sort of coming back to Stephen Castle's themes. To me, the independent migrants are closer to the traditional nation-building notion of migration and settlement, whereas if you think about it, the nomination schemes are much more about contemporary brain circulation interpretations of migration. But I think the balance is getting a bit out of whack. Both of those are very valuable. But what's happening in particular is the success of the nomination schemes in sustaining employment, which is quite undeniable. In the short term, because you've come out for a job, of course you're being well employed. But when you compare that with the migration position 2 or 3, 5, 7 years downstream of independent migrants versus migrants who pathway in from temporary migration, you actually find that the independent migrants have got much better outcomes in the longer haul. So at the moment, for instance, you can get in, an assistant mining engineer, but you can't get in a PhD in astrophysics from MIT under the independent sort of point system at the moment. And so what you're finding is the average skill level of the nominated entry categories seem to be going down and down compared to the average skill level cutoff of independent migration entry. So I'm not sure we've got the balance right between the two for the long-term development of Australia as opposed to short-term employment benefits. But again, short-termist politicians, you can see why they don't want to be blamed for creating unemployment by bringing in migrants who take time to settle. So there's a real tension there that I think we haven't addressed thoroughly.
Hi, my question's about, you mentioned the India incident, for example. How long does that sort of bad publicity take for things to change? And how sensitive are people to it, and how sort of important is the perception of social harmony and tolerance of an Australian society for people looking to come to study here?
It's crucial, of course, as the Indian incident showed. And it was a good wake-up call for universities and their communities to get their act into better order. What closer analysis showed, for instance, was that problems on campuses were quite minimal, but problems in communities around campuses were quite severe. There were a lot of incidents. A lot became well known in Sydney newspapers around Macquarie University, for instance, and the hostility of some surrounding communities to students, their impact upon local residential arrangements and transport arrangements and so on. So I think we were not paying enough attention to the social dimensions and community dimensions of international student life, which in Australia is so much more complicated than places like Britain and the US and Canada, where so much is residential on campus. Now, one response has been the huge growth in investment in campus living facilities, but it's also been a growth of community liaison, long overdue, between universities in general about a good community around university areas instead of just treating yourself as a little introverted, isolated community. So it was important. It wasn't important for Chinese students compared to Indian students for obvious reasons. Namely, India was an open democracy with a rampant press, and attacks on Chinese students were simply managed by the Chinese government and negotiated with Australia, whereas attacks on Indian students, often by other Indian students it turned out, when the dust settled, were nevertheless blown up immensely and produced a huge drop in Indian numbers, not much diminution in Chinese numbers, and now a resurgence in Indian numbers. And it produced a bit of a clean-up in the migration processes that were part of the problems around that. There was some ham-fisted administration of queues and policy settings and grandfathering of commitments that I think we're doing more sensibly now.
The gentleman and then one at the front. Glenn, thank you. Great presentation. Just want to ask about the quality of teaching within the higher education sector. With all of the changes that have been happening with funding and about publish or perish sort of mentality that exists within the university system, is there a general sense that the good professors within the university system are not out teaching as much as they should, in your opinion? Thank you.
Certainly the facts would seem to support that. That is, the Group of Eight just put out something this week that looked at the changing composition of university workforces. And there's been a big increase in the share of full-time researchers and a big increase in the share of part-time casual workforce. So your conventional teaching and research academic, who puts them all together in one package, is a diminishing species that's only about half the workforce now. That used to be the model of 20 years ago. It is clearly compromised in two ways. Full-time teachers who don't have proper career prospects and can be exploited during the process. So a lot of the casuals, yes, are great. They're doctors and specialists who do some teaching on top of their work as an adjunct. But so many others are doctoral students and postdoctorals who are just being obliged to do all the dirty teaching while the senior academics go ahead and do the research that the universities then want for their prestige in the ranking systems. So we've got a number of distorted incentives at the moment that are undermining good career prospects for young researchers and teachers and academics, and a focus on research not balanced with teaching and engagement. And somehow we've got to rethink the incentive systems by which universities are rewarded. Now, in part, it's going to be academics do want the applause of their peers. It's what drives them. But they also do respond more than that. Freud once said that academics are people who forsake power, fame, money for the sake of the pursuit of knowledge and truth so that they can obtain power, fame, money.
Just one last quick question here.
Hello. You refer to to Australia broadly in the context of higher education and international student numbers, but I've got a question here about South Australia. We particularly tend to get lower numbers, and I wonder why that is so and what we could do to change it. And just in addition, I was at Central Queensland University in Rockhampton, which for a long time, Rockhampton's a fairly small regional centre. It actually is a city, but only just, in Queensland. And it had very high proportions of international students for a long time and was amongst the highest in Australia. So what can South Australia do to raise, to increase the numbers of international students?
Well, not the CQU model, which for so long was actually becoming a problem. That is, it had such huge shares of international students that domestic students felt crowded out. So you've got to get that balance right. And also it was doing it through commercial partnerships, which became sort of dubious, and it ended up rejecting some of those partnerships and re-establishing it. Today it's back on keel just nicely. It's a very well-run university, but for a while there it was going off course, too much commercialisation. And those international student numbers were especially funny little campuses in the major capital cities. They weren't out at Rocky. They were in Sydney and Melbourne in sort of office blocks. And it was just office blocks full of a couple of floors of international students who didn't even mix with domestic students. And so the model just got out of balance. And I think CQU realised that, and it's restored balance and is emerging fine as a university now. But for a while there, it was the one public university that politicians would point to and say, you can't be left to manage yourselves. Look what happens. And for a while it was causing real problems for, the Melbournes and Sydneys were suddenly being told, we're going to now impose regulators on you because of CQU. So it really got it wrong. Now, what can South Australia do? Different problem. Of course, it has been trying substantially with the attraction of the international campuses, the UCLs and Carnegie Mellons, which I think were great initiatives. I'm not so convinced about, what's the laureate one? Torrens? I'd worry about for-profit universities because I think that distorts research. But as a college, I think it's fine as a teaching college, just as private for-profit colleges are a nice complement to public universities and public TAFEs. But research, I'm not happy about that for-profit motive. But I think that what Adelaide has been doing is strong and positive. The one thing I think that's missing at the moment, though, is that strange, what's it called, co-opetition between the three major public universities, where they don't really cooperate according to a strategic plan, and then every now and again Flinders is left out, or you know, the University of South Australia will do special deals with some parts of universities and so on. That lack of proper cooperation for South Australian universities, I think, could make a big difference if but you know, what do? You can't interfere with the autonomy of universities because you lose the research integrity. So somehow they've got to be persuaded to cooperate better. And money is usually the answer.
Would you like to join with me in thanking Glenn for